Hey gang, welcome to this episode, Strange Tales from the Water. Thanks to those who submitted their stories, and I'm still collecting for a Valentine's Day show about crazy relationships and exes. But, as always, send anything you have to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. Now, kick back and don't get your feet wet. Let's begin. Creature in the Lake, submitted by Taskmaster. You wanted a fishing story, so here's one. My dad used to take me to this lake in Florida to fish every summer. It was one of those places that basically only caters to fishermen, but it did have a pool and a little store for families and whatnot. Anyway, we went out there for a weekend, and he was the kind of guy that insisted on going out at like 4 in the morning. I know that's a popular thing with fishers, but I don't know if there's any science behind that theory. Out we go in our 10-foot aluminum boat with my dad at the engine, and we're zipping along the shoreline in about 10 feet of water when suddenly we slammed into something. We hit it so hard I thought I was going to fly out of the boat. My dad cut the engine and shone his big flashlight around, but we didn't see anything. We were looking for logs or something else that was floating in the water. Suddenly, off to our right, about 5 feet away, I saw a shape come up from the water. My dad put the light on it, and I almost crapped myself. It was a head covered in thick hair. For a second, I thought we had hit a swimmer, but then this thing moved into shallower water, maybe 6 feet deep, and it was a thing covered in hair. It turned to look at us, and I swear it had these glowing eyes, but maybe that was just the flashlight. But it was huge. I have it burned into my head. It must have been 7 or 8 feet tall, and it looked like a gorilla man. It stared at us for a few seconds before turning and splashing its way to the shoreline, where it grabbed onto a tree branch and hoisted itself up. It stayed standing there for a couple of minutes, scratching at its back, and we just kept staring, not saying a word. I think we hit its back with the boat, and maybe it was checking to see if it was hurt. After a bit, it kind of just smashed its way through the trees and weeds, kicking up a ton of noise. I looked back at my dad, and all he said was, "Well, that was something, huh?" We never told anybody about what we had seen, but we talked about it when no one else was around, until the day he finally passed away. It was actually one of the last things we spoke about. Dad was right. That sure was something. Canoe Mishap by Cool Change. Floating down various rivers of the Missouri Ozarks in a canoe with a few friends and a lot of beer figured very prominently in my mid and late teens and throughout my 20s. It was on one of these rivers that I came very close to dying. Late in the afternoon, which meant many beers into the day, I decided it was time for me to swim. We were floating over a deep, clear hole, so I stood up in the canoe and dove into the water, much to the surprise of my canoe partner. The water was crystal clear and so cool, and I was swimming along about 8 to 10 feet underwater, really enjoying myself, until my chest started burning for a lack of air. I swam to the surface, and as I broke it, I took another deep breath, and I got a brief glimpse of a canoe paddling hard down the river. The next thing I knew, I was on the riverbank with a couple of people standing around me. Apparently, I had surfaced right in front of a canoe that was paddling hard to get off the river because they were ready to be done for the day. That canoe and I had collided, and it knocked me out cold. As I sank below the water and the canoe passed over me, the guy in the back reached down and grabbed my hair to pull me back up, and then they towed me to the riverbank behind their canoe. I never was able to piece together how long I was unconscious, but it was definitely long enough for a crowd to gather. I have no idea how I lived through my indestructible years. What's that line about God protecting drunks and fools? I guess that's what it was. Whitewater Nightmare, submitted by Finance Dude. This was when I was a 20-something stupid, afraid-of-nothing guy and went with a group of friends to raft Thompson's Canyon in Colorado. Back then the industry wasn't well regulated, and they would take anyone out almost any time, including this time, which was an early summer day after a heavy snow year, so the river was running extremely high and fast. None of us had ever set foot inside a raft before. They offered a trip where you could just sit and let a pro paddle, but that wasn't for us. We took the trip where we each had to paddle, particularly since the guide riding the back of our raft turned out to be another 20-something in a very small bikini. Oh man, the memories of her. But that's another story. We started paddling following her commands, 1 right, 2 left, etc., meaning the number of paddle strokes to the left or the right. We did great in the calm water, though half of us were horny guys looking to the back to see our guide. Then the rapids began, small at first, then bigger and bigger. I mean, so big that we were actually looking at the rapids instead of the guide at this point. The commands came faster and faster. 1 right, 1 left, 2 left, 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 left! The raft was really moving up and down, side to side in those rapids, with water splashing all over the place. The water temp was probably in the 40s, though we were working too hard to notice the cold. We eventually reached the big one. I forget what it was called, but it had some nasty name. The biggest water hole in the river. As we neared it, the guide yelled louder and louder, and by then we were like robots following her commands as the hole got closer and closer. 2 right, 1 left! And then nothing. I looked back and no guide. She had flipped out of the raft and was floating along about 4 boat lengths behind us. That's when we panicked. We each had our ideas about how to get through this hole. Those who thought we should paddle right paddled right, and those who thought we should paddle left paddled left. We were about evenly divided, so we went down the middle and right into that hole, where we all did sort of a backflip as the raft went into the hole, got sucked into it, flipped back and started a sort of washing machine motion. In fact, we all did, except for the guide who I saw shooting past the hole and down the river. At least we had our life jackets on, but we were getting sucked in and out of the cold water, and what a strong current and undertow there was. The raft somehow managed to pop out of the hole, and so did 2 or 3 other guys, but 3 or 4 of us were stuck in the washing machine for what seemed like forever, though it was probably less than a minute. I managed to grab one guy for a while and then lost him, and someone grabbed me but lost me, and then we started going around and around, up and down, over and over. I saw some rocks that we wedged ourselves into and freed ourselves a little bit by a little bit. We finally managed to get out of the hole and began floating down the river. We swam to the bank as we floated and eventually came to slow-moving water, and we all made it out safely, even the raft. It was then we realized just how cold it was. We were shivering and going hypothermic, so we went and gathered some wood from the banks, and with the help of a kid on the raft, we started a fire and got warm. We stayed around that fire for about an hour before we got warm enough to get back in the raft, go down to the pullout, and finally feel safe. That was one close call, but thinking back about it, man, what a rush. Or maybe it was that guide that made it all worthwhile. Monster after the storm. On a 41-foot sailboat in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, with about 7 other guys, was doing a shakedown test cruise, planned out to be for about 12 hours. This was in the mid-1980s. Not as reliable weather prediction resources were there, so we did get caught in a tropical storm, with winds gusting into the 50-mile-an-hour range. It was just short of a weak hurricane. We had just barely rigged storm hawsers and storm sails because the fellow on board who was our best sailor sensed the storm was almost on us, and otherwise we would have died. During the storm itself, I expected to die at any time. In fact, we made a sécurité, sécurité call on the radio. If you have time at sea, you'll know what I'm talking about, but if not, it's not that important. For what seemed like 15 minutes, we were in a maelstrom, no visibility, and then suddenly it passed and we would live. This was about 3 p.m., and although there was cloud cover, of course, the ambient light was such that you could see 2 or so miles in any direction. If you're familiar with the sea, you know that such storms, particularly in shallow depths near land masses, dredge a lot of things from the sea floor. We were all on deck, working lines, checking equipment, checking damage, and the bay around us was choppy and churning and foaming. Older sailors often use the saying, "the sea is confused" when it gets like this. I looked about 15 feet on the starboard side, and something swam to the surface, broke it, looked at us, and then submerged. It was like a thin man with humanoid shape, arms articulated like a man. It had a small human head, but its skin was covered in scales like a snake. It looked at us, blinked its weird, heavy-lidded eyes, and then dove back under the foaming water. You need to know a few things about me at that moment. No drugs, no alcohol, no injuries. I was happy to just be alive and got through that, but my senses in that situation were sharpened, not dulled. At that time, I had about 6 years of experience on ships and fishing boats, and had seen squid, octopi, flying fish, sharks, skates, you name it, and I've seen them all around the world. I'm not the type of guy to see a patch of seaweed and call it a sea monster. I made an instant decision that I was not going to say anything about it. I mean, what could I say? I just saw a strange creature. Take my word for it? Yeah, the men on that boat were all mechanics and engineers and professionals. Why get a reputation as a flake? At the time, it was important for each of us to get D skipper or OOD qualifications, and saying something like that would be frowned upon. As I stood there in my life vest, soaking wet, hooked into the steel lifeline, glad to be alive, one of the other sailors, a USN captain with over 30 years' experience in the surface Navy, piped up and said, "I just saw a brown thing pop up on the surface. This sounds weird, but it looked like a lizard man with a scaly face, and it blinked at us with these big eyes, and then it went back under." "Yeah, I saw it too," I said. Apparently no one else had seen it, just the two of us. So we sailed back to the pier later that day and never spoke of it again. Houseboat Horror, submitted by Adam. Here's a scary boating story that happened to me and my friends when we rented a houseboat in Pennsylvania. We were all a couple of years out of college and we wanted to get together for something to do in the summer of 2008. It was me, I'll say my name is Adam for this story, Jeff and Phil, who were twin brothers. We were all going to rent this big houseboat for the week with our girlfriends and just cruise up and down a lake and have a good time. Also with us were my girlfriend at the time, I'll call her Tara, Phil's woman and his now wife, Marie, and Jeff was dating a woman named Michelle. It was mid-July when we all met at my parents' house and drove to the marina, and holy shit, if you've never been on one of these things, I really recommend it. But the start of our trip was a little bit rocky to say the least, and that's what this story's about. The boat was about 50 feet long, had a full kitchen, 3 berths, a full bath, and a slide from the roof, and even a hot tub up there. We would literally just go anywhere we wanted, moor the boat, and get our party on. The weather was looking good, so we loaded up the food and tons of beer, wine, and booze. We had poker chips, Phil brought his PlayStation, and man, we knew we were in for a good time. I pulled out of the marina slip and carefully started cruising down the lake. Getting the hang of driving these things takes a bit, but mainly because it's just so big. Once we were away from land, I grabbed a Yingling from the fridge and just tooled around as the others set up the bedrooms and got ready to sunbathe on the deck. Jeff came over to me while the others were outside, and he'd already gotten into a fight with Michelle. They were known for their epic fights, and I told him to grab a beer and just relax. I was hoping the whole week wasn't going to be like that, but I would be proven wrong, and Michelle did cause some things to go wrong. We stopped in a little bay area for the day about an hour later as the weather took a turn for the worse and it started raining a bit. We didn't care. We sat on the front of the boat under the covered area drinking and talking and such, and Jeff and Michelle were back to being cool, and despite the clouds and sprinkles, it was a blast. Phil fired up the grill and Tara helped make some hot dogs as we talked about going to this place called the Cliffs the next day. You can climb up them and jump off into the water, and we were just pumped to be spending our time together. We all got pretty sauced and fell asleep in various parts of the boat after we went inside. I woke up and went into the kitchen to get a bottle of water and flicked on the lights. And I thought I heard someone on the roof, and thought maybe, it's Jeff or Phil, but then I saw Jeff lying on the couch. I heard another thump, and then went back to the sleeping quarters, peeked in on Tara, and looked downstairs to see the legs of Phil, Michelle, and Marie. Who the hell was up there? I went back into the kitchen, turned off the lights, and went over to Jeff and poked him. "What the fuck are you doing?" he asked me loudly, and I gave him the shut up and listen gesture and pointed to the ceiling. There were more footsteps, but they were sneaky footsteps, like whoever it was working hard to not be heard. Jeff went to the door and quietly opened it, and we listened. Nothing was going on. I went inside and heard the footsteps moving to the back of the boat, and remembered that my bedroom led to the back deck. I ran back just in time to see a naked figure staring in at Tara with his hands up to the window trying to get a better look. I yelled and the guy, it was a guy, jumped a bit and then turned and threw himself into the water. A second later I heard another splash as somebody else jumped in. By the time I got out to the deck, both guys had vanished, but I could hear them swimming away. Everyone was now up after me yelling and wanted to know what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight and searched around the boat, and Jeff went up on the roof with another light, but we didn't see anything. The girls were totally freaked out, and honestly, so was I. I really didn't want to move the boat in the dark, and I didn't know what to do, and Tara finally calmed me down, and Phil said he'd stay up and stand guard if anyone came back. I was keyed up at this point and said, fuck it, I'll stay up, everyone else go back to bed. But Tara did stay up with me in the living room. She didn't want to be alone in bed. I grabbed a couple of beers and started playing Grand Theft Auto while Tara curled up on the couch next to me. Nothing else major happened that night, but I did hear some tapping outside the boat, and when I went to the window, it was just small waves hitting the side of it, so I thought, man, I've got to stop being paranoid. Eventually, I fell asleep around 4 and slept for a few hours. The next day, the girls made breakfast, and Jeff and I got the boat moving. Phil was looking at a map and told me how to get to the cliffs, and that it looked like a little farther up, and there was another cove that would be a great spot to stop for the evening after we were done there. It didn't take long to get there, and Phil threw in the anchor, and we swam over to the cliffs to brave the jump. Only Michelle came with us, as Marie and Tara said they were no way doing that. They wanted to lay in the sun and, quote, watch us morons. There were a bunch of other people there, and I guess there was a campground nearby, and it was a popular place. Other boats showed up, and it was actually kind of fun jumping into the water, and we met some cool people. Michelle and Jeff got into it again, and while we were still jumping and swimming, I noticed she was talking to a couple of other guys our age. Jeff saw it too, and when I said, man, should we go over there? He said, nope, fuck her. I went over anyway and said hi to the guys who said their names were Randy and Carl. I'm using those names, but I have no idea if they were their real names. That's just what they said. They seemed pretty cool, and they said they were staying at the campground, and it was cool to see us, as most of the people at the campground were families. Michelle was being a little flirty, if you asked me, but I figured, hey, it's not my business, so I stayed out of it. Eventually, we got tired of the cliffs and went back to the boat, and after going to get Michelle, who was still talking to the guys. This is important to what happened later. Jeff was pretty pissed, but I told him to let it go, and if he actually cared, he would have gone over to her and fixed the problem. He just went to his room and sulked, while Phil and I got the boat over to another bay called the Old Cliffs, and we moored there for the rest of the day and what we thought would be the night. The beer and wine was flowing, and Tara kept hinting to me that we should go do some reading in our room. Yeah, reading. We fooled around, and I look back at that now and think, how tacky was that, having sex with our friends just a couple of feet away? Oh well, we were young and it was fun. We made dinner on the grill again, and as it got dark, Jeff and Michelle disappeared for a little slap and tickle as they had made up. The rest of us were on the roof in the hot tub talking and laughing when we heard Michelle scream and Jeff yell, "Who the fuck are you?" Phil and I immediately jumped up and ran to the ladder to see what was going on. It was about 10 o'clock and obviously dark. Phil yelled to Jeff asking what was up, and Jeff said when the two of them came out of their berth and into the living room, there was a guy on the front of the boat near the grill, but he jumped over the side when he saw them. Was this the same guy from the night before? I didn't care. I immediately went to the wheel, told Jeff to pull anchor, and that we were getting the fuck out of there. There was some chirping from the girls on the roof as I fired things up and started motoring away from the bay, but there was no way I was staying there. I drove across the water and up a ways to another spot before stopping. Everyone gathered in the living area and was pretty freaked out. Jeff had already called the sheriff to let them know this happened twice and where we were. They said to call back if it happened again, and things settled down once again, and we had a few more drinks to calm down even further. We made sure all the doors and stuff were locked before we went to our rooms for the night. About 2 in the morning, I woke up to movement on the roof again. I waited for my eyes to adjust to the dark, and saw a figure coming down the ladder. It was a naked guy. Randy, to be exact. He had a hunting knife in his hand, and as I got up, I actually stumbled backwards, as I hadn't even seen Carl, who was right at the door, naked, a knife in one hand and his dick in the other. This psycho was jerking off onto the glass, watching me and Tara lay in bed. Our eyes met each other, and I couldn't even muster a shout. He looked beyond crazy, and did what happens when you punch the clown. It went all over the glass, and he tapped the knife on the glass with the sickest grin I have ever seen. I reached for Tara, and by now Randy was standing next to Carl, and he actually ran his knife in hand through the stuff on the glass. They both backed up, and Carl put his finger up to his lips doing the shh motion, and then waved his finger at me going, "No, no, no." I stood there dumbfounded, and they simply went to the railing and jumped into the water and disappeared into the blackness. Tara was now awake, and I finally said, "Oh, fuck. What the fuck?" She asked what happened, and I pointed to the glass, not knowing how to tell her what I just saw. I finally did, and she screamed out, which woke everybody else up. We called the sheriff again, and this time they told us to stay put, and they came out to us in a launch. I told them everything that had been happening, and that's when we found out that, number one, the cops were pretty aware of these guys. They were known for this shit like this and weren't camping. They lived out there. 2, they had likely followed us from the marina on day 1. And 3, Michelle had told them where we were staying off the old cliffs. Thanks, Michelle. We filed a full report, and the debate was on as to whether or not we should just go home. I manned up, cleaned up the stuff off the glass after the sheriffs took a swab of it and looked for fingerprints. Despite all that crazy shit, we voted to stay, but I drove the boat much farther away, and the rest of the week was good with nothing bad happening. Man, I'll tell you what, there are some messed up people out there, and while no one got hurt and those freaks didn't attack us, they could have. If you're willing to sneak onto a boat and beat off in front of a guy while staring at his girlfriend with a knife in your hand, I think you're pretty much capable of anything. Blast off. I was fishing in a 17-foot Mohawk canoe off the main bridge in Titusville, Florida. This was around 2000. That area is teeming with fish, and I headed for a trough that NASA cut out to build the fuel railroad system out to the launch area. This spot holds black drum as well as other tasties. I had a trolling motor on the side of the canoe, and I headed down for my spot on the south shore. Over to my left, just as I arrived at the south end of the trough, I saw a pod of manatee in the water about 75 yards away. I had a little camera stowed away, and I decided to get some up-close pics for my kids. I turned west into the middle of the lagoon area and headed over to shallow water and grass beds with my trolling motor turned up to 5, which was top speed. I noticed it appeared very shallow immediately ahead of me, so I cut the motor to 0. That's the last thing I remember before I heard the loudest noise I ever heard, and it came from all around me. The water exploded around and under my 75-pound canoe with my 105-pound body in the back. The front of my canoe went up at a 45-degree angle, and the rear of my canoe with me in it came off the surface of the water with such an amount that my battery came off the floor. In the front of my canoe, all my tackle and such was launched into the air, and I remember seeing a single large pinfish arcing over the whole mess as I gripped the gunnels. It wasn't obvious what happened to me for a minute, and I was so shaken up that I was vulnerable and unsure if it would happen again, so I reattached things back to my trolling motor, the wires had come loose I guess, and I went to the shoreline where the railroad actually passed by. I got out and tried to piece my equipment back together. The pod of roughly 21 manatees had come into the lagoon area recently, and as it turns out, they have a similar danger signal as beavers. They slap the surface of the water. They were really frightened by my entry into the area, and when that many do that and slap the water and it's in 2 feet of water, it can almost violate the laws of bowel physics. Trust me, I know. I was safe, but that was scary. Frostbite Regatta by Finally Retired. One of my own scary experiences was a 2-day frostbite regatta on the Chesapeake in wind and rain and water and air temps both in the mid-50s. My crew was beginning to show symptoms of hypothermia, so when we returned to the dock I sent everyone home to warm up while I stayed behind. I was left as the only person at the marina, and I was a bit hypothermic myself, so I wasn't thinking straight. Our vessel was a 25-foot trailerable sailboat, but I was too tired to pull it out, so I went to tie it up to a mooring ball a couple of 100 yards offshore, pulling my hard dinghy along. I secured everything, including the swimming ladder and life jackets, stepped into the dinghy, lost my balance, and into the water I went. The wind and current quickly took the dinghy away, and I couldn't manage the 5-foot freeboard to pull myself back on. But there was a line hanging from the stern, which I tried to use to pull myself back in a couple of times before slipping and going underwater. By this time, I lost feeling in my hands and could no longer manage any more. I knew I could not swim to shore in these conditions, so I tied myself off as tightly as possible to that line, got into a fetal position, and waited for rescue while periodically yelling out. Long story short, someone eventually saw me from shore and called 911, and I got rescued by DNR after being in the water for maybe 30 minutes. My core temp was 94, and honestly, another 10 minutes in that water, I would have died from hypothermia. When I was taken to shore, I had no idea about my condition, so I refused to go to the fire station to be warmed up. I told them I was going to get in my car and drive home. I stood up and my legs crumbled underneath me, and the next thing I knew, I was wrapped in blankets inside the fire station. Obvious lesson: always wear a life jacket. Now I wear one whenever I'm on a dock before I even get into a boat, and I don't take it off until I'm off the dock. Another lesson, correctly applied: never try to swim in cold water. The water passing your body robs you of body heat, and hypothermia sets in quickly. Nearly half of anyone who tries to swim 50 yards or more in 50-degree water dies of hypothermia. Oh, did I say we came in second in the regatta? 5 seconds off of first. What Happened Out There? By Noble. I was once canoeing the boundary waters between Minnesota and Canada. These aren't your normal backyard ponds. The boundary waters are thousands of enormous lakes interconnected with each other. Think like mini Great Lakes. We had been canoeing and camping along the lakes for about a week at this point. We didn't really have an itinerary, just planned to boat and camp, fish, and live off the land for 2 weeks. We had a GPS and a satellite phone to call for a helicopter for pickup if we were ever in trouble. Anyway, about a week in, we were set to canoe a few hours to the next lake, and an hour or so in, we were in the center of an extremely long and narrow lake. Unfortunately, a storm started to blow in, and the waves on the lake swelled over 2 feet, and too much for our dinky canoes. We pulled off to a random clearing on the shore and set up camp quickly to avoid being totally thrashed by the rainstorm. We just set up camp and then hunkered down for the night. By the next morning it had cleared up, and we started walking up the coast of the lake about 200 feet from our camp looking for a good fishing spot. What we actually found was another campsite. It was absolutely wrecked. Trash strewn everywhere, tents collapsed and torn, clothes on the ground, and at first we were just disgusted, what assholes did this or left their shit out here to be bear food? The more we looked around, though, the weirder things seemed to be. For one, their garbage was still hoisted into a tree to keep it safe from bears, but the whole bag was ripped open despite being 30 feet in the air. Second, literally everything except the canoes were still at the campsite. Clothes, packs, food, rope, pans, a serious set of hiking equipment, enough for 2 or 3 people. And half of it was trashed and torn open, mostly the packs, tent, and clothes, but the other half was totally untouched, just thrown to the ground. Like someone noped the hell out of there in nothing but their long johns, ditching hundreds of dollars of gear in the process. We waited a couple of hours and eventually called it back to our helicopter crew, but they hadn't been aware of anybody else or gotten any distress calls. We eventually just left everything and moved camp. Everybody was pretty upset by it, and a day or 2 later we ended the whole trip early because it just seemed like no one wanted to be out there anymore. It was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. First thought was bear attack, but there was food left uneaten, and I've seen bear attacks on camps before, and it was nothing like this. Bears usually just rip open packs and go after food, and they're generally pretty easy to scare away. What still sticks with me is why all their clothes and packs were still there, with half being totally destroyed and the other half not being touched. I still don't get it. I've done a lot of other camping and hiking, rafting and biking, all around the country, and I've never had any other weird experiences like that. Thanks for listening, gang. Hope you enjoyed this jaunt into the weird side of the water. And if you haven't, please like, subscribe, and share my channel. And follow me on social media too. All the links to those are in the description, as well as a link to my Patreon page. You can throw me a tip there if the mood strikes you. Remember to send your scary stories to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read everything you send. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, be wary of things that go bump in the night. Could be anything. A ghost, The monster or the guy next door?